Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video we're going to look at how we optimize photographs using the histogram. And the histogram is up here on the right hand side of the screen. And what it's showing you is your exposure levels for your different colors, all the way from your brightest down to your darkest. Brightest being on the right, darkest and shadows being on the left. And we're only going to look in this video at our tone controls, so exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks, and how we use these to manipulate the histogram in our photograph, right? So the histogram is just a graphical representation of our photograph over here, so that we understand what all these sliders actually do inside of our photograph. And being able to understand that will actually make you better at post-production and making your photographs actually pop out and look much more, you're more professional, more pleasing to people whenever they see them. Okay, so let's first of all just cover what these sliders do. So if we look at exposure, right, it's changing the exposure that we actually used on the camera, whether it's brighter, letting in more light, or darker, letting in less light. And if we pull this to the right, it shifts our whole histogram up towards the bright side. And if we pull it to the left, it shifts our entire histogram all the way to the left. And whenever we do that, so if you can see, I mean, we're adding a lot more. We're darkening the entire photo, or we're brightening the entire photo, right? So if we put this back, now contrast on the other side, if we move the contrast bar to the left, it is basically compressing the histogram into the center. It's pushing our darks to the right to be brighter, and our brighters to the left to become darker. And if we push it to the right, it's doing the exact opposite. It's flattening and stretching out our histogram. See? And so it's making our darks darker and our whites whiter, and so that's how that works out. So, all right. The next thing is our highlights. So highlights moves the bright sections of our photo. If we shift it to the right, it makes them brighter. And if we move it to the left, it makes them darker. And as you can see on our histogram, it's just impacting the right hand, the brightest part of our histogram, right? And the shadows do the exact opposite. If I pull the shadows to the right, it's going to shift the left-hand side of my histogram to the right. And if I push it to the left, it's going to do the same thing and make my shadows darker, and that's how that's going to work. Now, whites and blacks. So whites and blacks only affect in this case, whites will impact the brightest part of the histogram, or the brightest parts of the picture, right? So if I shift it, it's going to, you know, like you can see the white or the light areas here on the house. The house here is one of the brightest areas in the picture. If I shift this over to the right, it's going to make that even brighter. But it's not really impacting my shadows or my midtones as much. So blacks are the same thing. If I shift the black off to the right, the darker parts of the picture just become darker, right? Let's get started onto the main part of this video. So up in the top right hand corner, you can see on this picture up here, we got kind of an overexposed picture, and everything in the histogram is shifted over to the right. Now, if we look at another picture, this picture, everything is underexposed, so everything's shifted to the left. So whenever we're looking at the histogram and we look at this graph, if we have, like on this one, where everything's piled up on the left, our picture is underexposed, and we have nothing up in the highlight area. And on this one, the exact opposite is true. So these are the two basic forms of with your photography. You have underexposed and overexposed photos. So, but we also have some other things that could actually occur. So if we look at this one, this isn't really too bad, but we don't have a whole lot of detail on the exposure up on the highlights, but the picture's not really underexposed or overexposed. It might be slightly underexposed. So we'll look at that. And in this picture here, this is very unique where it's split. So down here in the bottom part of my image, it's underexposed, and up in the top part of the image, I am overexposed. And how we can see that is up here in our histogram. If I mouse over or click on that arrow on the right, it will show me all my areas that are overexposed. And if I click on the triangle on the left, it will show me my areas that are underexposed. So we look here on this one, the underexposed ones show up in blue, and the overexposed one shows up in red. And then it's basically because we have a sky in the background, and so the sky is going to be bright, and we have this area down here by the waterfall, which is in shadow, and so it's going to be darker. So we're going to look at how we deal with both of these situations. So let's start with this overexposed picture. This will be rather simple. Now, whenever we look at the histogram, I mean, I can click up here on the red. If I click both of these, whenever I hit overexposed and underexposed, I'll be able to see that. Now, generally speaking, if I move the exposure slider and I pull it to the left, it is going to shift my entire picture, all my lighting to the left. So I'm bringing it down and I'm underexposing it. And you can see we've shifted this as we moved it to the right. So we started out over here with everything piling up on the right, and we moved it and we shift it more towards the center. And we can pull it way down and underexpose it, but that's not what we want to do. We want to shift it and kind of pull it in here so we have as much as we can get into the center. Now, when you come down to highlights, now what I can do is, so I want to pull some more because I'm still clipping up in this area up here. And you always hear clipping is bad. In this case, this picture, it is bad, but there's certain scenarios where clipping isn't bad. And we'll look at those here in a little bit too. But what you're going to do is grab your highlight slider and we're going to pull that down to the left. And as you can see, I have now pulled those highlights down so it's no longer clipping up here on the top on this roof section. This is inside of the market at Covent Gardens in London, in the market there. And so you can see this glass ceiling inside of the market. And what I was trying to do is capture the British flags. And so we're dragging those highlights down. Now I can bring my shadows back, and what that's going to do is it'll shift it up, but I didn't need to shift up too much because whenever I drug my exposure down and brought my exposure, and I was kind of overexposed in the first place, I kind of got my exposure and my shadows kind of where I want. Now, what I can do is if I bring my whites back up, I can bring them up just a hair, but I don't want them to clip. But then I can bring my blacks down till just right before they clip. So I got a little clipping down here in the bottom left-hand corner, and I am pretty happy with that. And so now what I can do as well is if my contrast, so I want to spread this out a little bit more, I can drag the contrast across and it will actually spread that out. See how that's working? So it's spread out those levels of light across the picture. So if I were to bring it the other way, it's going to crunch them all up in the middle. And that's not really what I want to do. I don't want my picture to look flat. So I want to bring up a little bit of contrast to kind of spread that out just a hair. And I got just a little bit of clipping in the shadows down here, but I mean, I'm pretty happy. So I have shadows where my whole image is underexposed. So what I'm going to do is the same technique. I'm going to drag my exposure up until I drag those my light so it's spread across the histogram, and you can see I've got a good exposure now. Now here's the thing. So I can either drag down here. It's good to know this if you're interested. But the highlights I can grab down here. And if I pull that all the way to where I want it, giving myself a little bit of space there, right? It adjusts the slider down here. Same thing with the shadows, except I don't want to drag the shadows down there yet. So I've got this. What I'm going to do is now if I drag this over the highlights, and how I can do this is if I come into, where's it at? Here, I'm just grabbing these whites, and I can make them whiter, which we'll just drag it up into there. I don't want it to clip. And then my blacks, I can do the same thing. I can bring it down, but I'm not going to drag it off, right? And so you can see this looks much better than when we started. I've got really good exposure on this. Let's see if the before, yep. So you see where we started before, we were underexposed, and now in the after we have good exposure all across the histogram here. Now let's take a look at this picture. So we have this, and we're a little bit on the underexposed side up here, but we're not really too bad off. We could shift this over. So I mean, I could pull the exposure over, but what I think I could do, if I pull the highlights over and pull the whites over, I'm going to end up doing something like this, where I'm still keeping this dark, but not too bad up in the sky. And then I've got this light down here on the bottom. Versus if I go back through, let's reset this, and I drag the exposure over, it's going to shift the entire image and pull the exposure up. So now I'm kind of a little bit high here, but then I can also drop my highlights down. I can move my shadows up. I don't need to move them up too much, but now you can see I've got the histogram nice and stacked in the middle here. I'm probably gonna leave the whites where they're at and bring the blacks down just a hair. I don't want it to clip underneath the roof of the house there. If I do, I don't want it to clip too much. Okay, and then I can pull the contrast out to spread this out a little bit more. So this is kind of what I get with this, where I had this, but now I've got a little bit more brighter exposed across the entire image, versus if I wanted to go back through, not pull the exposure up, but pull the highlights up. I could do that. I could come up and pull these highlights over as far as I want to pull them. I'll see I've got it at 100%. And I could leave the shadows up, or I could bring the shadows over, and it's going to shift that over to the right, but not as far. And then I can pull these whites over until I start to clip. And so I'm clipping down here along the house. I don't want it to go up that far. So I'm just going to pull that back a hair. Yeah, I don't want it to clip it all down there. So, and I can do the same thing with the blacks. And I've kind of done that. So then we get this kind of effect where really I brought a little bit more color brightness out down here in the bottom, but left this section up here dark. And that's, depending on what you're trying to do, both of those could be effective. Now, this particular image has both shadow that's underexposed and overexposed. And as a general rule of thumb, if you're in a situation like this, usually I would shoot a high dynamic range image and shoot like a stack of 3 or 5 images so that I could actually get everything exposed correctly. But sometimes you might not do that, or you might not want to do that. So what we can do here is we are dealing with, let's see if we can drag those highlights down to bring. So see how we've brought those highlights down. We're no longer clipping in the sky, and I can see some detail of the clouds that were in the sky that day. And I'm going to do the same thing down here on the bottom. I'm going to pull these shadows over to the right. And you can see I'm moving that histogram back to the right now. And I could add more whites in, but then if I got to be careful not to start clipping. You saw how it started clipping right there. And then I can bring these blacks down, but I can't bring them down much because I'm going to end up starting to clip again. So, and if I actually bring the contrast over, I'm also going to start getting just a little bit of clipping down here, but I'm going to have to accept that, I think. So, but we ended up with this image that was underexposed and overexposed, and we were able to bring some more detail out by doing this using the histogram and looking at what we are doing with the light across the image. Okay, at the beginning of the video I talked about cases where clipping we're not so worried about, and this is an example of one. I've got this picture of these holly flowers, and I took them at night, and I used some handheld lights to actually light the flower, but you can see in the background this is all black, and if I turn the clipping on, you can see there's clipping all throughout that black area back there, but I'm not really too worried about that because I intended for that to actually be black anyway. I mean, that the light wasn't back there, and so it is black. So let's take a look at how we handle this. We got everything on the histogram piled up on the left, right? So we could increase exposure, right? And when I'm doing that, I'm starting to overexpose those flowers, because if you look at the histogram, what I've got is I've got like my yellows and stuff are actually over here on the highlight side. So what I can do is bring my shadows up, which shifts that histogram a little bit off to the right. And I can bring in a little bit of detail back here in the black where you can kind of just barely make something out, which is kind of what I'm after. And I can even bring the blacks up a little bit. But here's the thing that you have to be aware of. And so I can bring my whites down, or I can bring my highlights down to shift that back over, but I really don't want to. The focus of this picture is actually these flowers. And so whenever I'm adjusting my highlight, shadows, whites and blacks, and contrast and exposure, I'm doing that in relation to what it does to the flowers, and I'm not too worried about this black space back here, which is throwing my histogram off. So what we would end up really needing to do in these kinds of situations is we're going to do localized adjustments. So I would end up masking out this area here on the flowers and masking these areas over here that are dark, and handle those separately on these types of pictures. So that is how we use the histogram to actually improve upon our photographs, right? And make sure that we have a good exposure. So if you like this video, please do me a favor and hit the like button down below. And if you'd like to see more, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Take care.